There's a moment happening right now, quietly, on millions of desktops around the world, and it looks nothing like the dramatic Linux takes over the world headlines that have been promised and broken every year for the last 2 decades. There's no flashy launch event, no celebrity keynote, no billion-dollar ad campaign. It's just ordinary people, students, retirees, small business owners, entire government IT departments, sitting down at computers that have run Windows their whole lives and one by one installing something else instead. When people in tech circles talk about this as the biggest Linux migration since Windows 11 launched, they're not exaggerating for clicks. The numbers, the timing, and the reasons behind it all point to something genuinely different from the usual, this is the year of the Linux desktop cycle that's been a running joke since the early 2000s. This time, the joke might actually be running out of steam, because for the first time, the push isn't coming from Linux getting suddenly amazing. It's coming from Windows giving people very real, very practical reasons to leave. To understand why this is happening now, you have to start with the single biggest trigger event. Windows 10 officially reached its end of support on October 14th, 2025. After that date, Microsoft stopped delivering free security updates, bug fixes, and technical support for the operating system that, even late into 2024, was still running on the majority of the world's PCs. That's not a small detail. For years, Windows 10 was the dominant version of Windows by a wide margin, the OS that quietly powered offices, schools, and home computers everywhere, partly because so many people actively avoided upgrading to Windows 11 when it launched. Microsoft did offer an extended security updates program as a bridge, letting consumers stay protected for up to a year past the cutoff, either for free with a Microsoft account and synced settings, or for a small fee, and businesses can pay a scaling annual cost that climbs each year. But ESU was always designed as a temporary lifeline, not a long-term plan, and it expires for consumers in October 2026, which means the clock that started ticking when Windows 10 support ended is now running out fast, and a lot of people are starting to feel the pressure of an actual deadline rather than a vague someday upgrade decision. Here's where the real friction comes in, and it's the single biggest reason this migration wave looks different from anything before it. A huge number of computers that run Windows 10 perfectly well simply cannot run Windows 11 at all. Microsoft's hardware requirements for Windows 11, things like TPM 2.0 support, specific CPU generation cutoffs, and secure boot capability, locked out an enormous population of otherwise functional machines. We're not talking about ancient relics here, plenty of laptops and desktops that are only 6 or 7 years old, machines that still run everyday tasks like browsing, word processing, and video calls without any trouble. Simply don't qualify for the free Windows 11 upgrade because of a CPU generation cutoff or a missing security chip. For the owner of one of these machines, the choice Microsoft is effectively presenting is stark. Buy an entirely new computer, pay for extended security updates as a stopgap, keep running an operating system with no security patches and growing exposure to malware, or install something else that will actually keep using the hardware they already own. That fourth option, installing something else, is exactly where Linux distributions have stepped into a vacuum that Microsoft itself created. And the Linux options waiting on the other side of that decision are not the intimidating command-line-only systems that scared people away a decade ago. Distributions built specifically to ease this exact transition have positioned themselves directly at Windows 10 refugees. Linux Mint mimics the traditional Windows desktop layout closely enough that the learning curve is close to zero. A taskbar at the bottom, a start menu in the corner, familiar file management, while running comfortably on hardware that Windows 11 outright refuses to touch. Zorin OS has gone even further with its design philosophy, deliberately building an interface that echoes the Windows experience for users making the jump, and the distribution showed a striking pattern. The overwhelming majority of new downloads were coming from machines that had previously been running Windows, a strong signal that this isn't just existing Linux enthusiasts switching distros, it's actual Windows refugees arriving in real numbers. Ubuntu remains the most broadly recommended on-ramp for newcomers, thanks to its massive community and documentation. For gamers worried about leaving their library behind, Pop! OS and Nobara have built reputations specifically around strong out-of-the-box hardware driver support and gaming compatibility, addressing what used to be Linux's single biggest deal-breaker for everyday users. None of this required Linux to reinvent itself overnight. Most of these projects have been steadily improving for years. What changed is that Windows finally created a large enough population of people actively looking for an alternative that all that quiet improvement suddenly had an audience. It would be incomplete to frame this migration purely as a hardware compatibility story, though, because the dissatisfaction with Windows 11 itself has become a major accelerant in its own right, independent of the upgrade eligibility question entirely. A recurring complaint across forums and tech commentary in 2026 centers on Windows 11's design direction. The operating system has leaned increasingly on web-based interface technology for core system components, with elements like the Start menu and system menus built using frameworks more associated with web apps than native, desktop software which a lot of longtime users report feeling sluggish and disconnected compared to older, more lightweight native interfaces. Layered on top of that are persistent frustrations around forced updates that interrupt work without warning, system requirements that keep climbing, and a steady drumbeat of concern about telemetry. The data Windows collects about how a PC and its user behave, which Microsoft has increasingly tied to AI-powered features baked directly into the operating system. For users who are uncomfortable with how much of their everyday computer use is being monitored, packaged, and fed into Microsoft's broader AI and cloud strategy, Linux's reputation as a system that doesn't watch you the way Windows increasingly does isn't a niche ideological talking point anymore. It's become a mainstream, practical reason cited right alongside hardware compatibility and cost. Cost itself deserves its own spotlight in this story because it's quietly become one of the most persuasive arguments in the entire migration, especially as it's moved beyond individual users and into institutional decision-making. Linux costs nothing to install, has no licensing fees attached, and runs on hardware Windows 11 won't touch, which means for budget-conscious households, schools, libraries, and small businesses facing the Windows 10 cutoff, the financial math increasingly favors switching over, buying new hardware, or paying into extended security updates year after year. That logic, which has powered Linux adoption in developing economies for years, where the relative cost of a Windows license represents a real financial burden, has started spreading into markets that never used to feel that pinch as sharply as rising hardware prices and Microsoft's escalating ESU pricing structure for businesses, which increases each year a device stays enrolled, make the total cost of staying on Windows climb in a way that's hard to ignore on a spreadsheet. This is where the institutional side of the story gets genuinely remarkable, because it's no longer just individual enthusiasts switching their personal laptops. Entire governments are making the jump at a scale that's hard to overstate. In April 2026, France announced a national directive to migrate 2.5 million government workstations to Linux, with migration plans due by autumn. Not a pilot program, not a feasibility study, but an actual binding directive across the country's civil service. That decision didn't come out of nowhere. France's National Gendarmerie has already been running Linux since 2008 and currently operates more than 100,000 workstations on it, reportedly saving the government roughly €2 million a year in licensing costs alone. When a security and law enforcement agency has been quietly proving the model works at scale for nearly 2 decades, and the savings are documented and real, it becomes a lot easier for the rest of a national government to follow that same playbook rather than treat it as a risky experiment. Other governments and public institutions have watched this kind of move with real interest too, especially in an environment where data sovereignty and reducing dependence on any single foreign technology vendor have become serious policy considerations in their own right, not just budget line items. When the people responsible for a country's digital infrastructure start asking whether they want their daily computing tied that closely to decisions made by a single American company, switch to Linux, stop sounding like a hobbyist's pet project, and start sounding like basic risk management. None of this would matter as much if the actual experience of switching to Linux were still as painful as it was a decade or two ago, and this is genuinely the part that's changed the most. The old stereotype of Linux, needing to manually compile drivers from source code, edit obscure configuration files just to get Wi-Fi working, or spend a weekend troubleshooting why a printer won't connect, has faded dramatically for anyone using a modern, mainstream distribution. Hardware detection, driver installation, and software management are handled automatically by the installer in most cases now, the same way Windows itself handles them, and dedicated distributions built around an "it just works" philosophy let users go from a blank USB drive to a fully functional desktop in well under an hour. That ease of use shift matters enormously for the kind of switcher driving this wave, because the people now moving over aren't exclusively the technically sophisticated early adopters who've always been comfortable with Linux software. Developers, system administrators, security professionals who made this jump years ago for their own reasons. The new wave increasingly includes regular people who just want their existing computer to keep working safely without becoming a part-time IT project, and that's a fundamentally different audience than Linux has ever successfully reached before at this scale. Grassroots organizing has played a real role in lowering that barrier too, in a way that's easy to overlook if you're only looking at download numbers and market share charts. Campaigns specifically built around the Windows 10 cutoff, backed by major projects including Debian, Fedora, GNOME, KDE, and Zorin OS, have organized volunteer networks and local repair cafe-style events specifically to help people physically install Linux on their existing machines, free of charge, with another human in the room to answer questions and fix problems on the spot. These efforts are intentionally distro-agnostic, meaning the goal isn't to recruit people into any one camp or community, but simply to get viable, supported operating systems onto hardware that would otherwise be heading for a landfill or living out its days unpatched and increasingly vulnerable. That kind of in-person, judgment-free support addresses the single biggest psychological barrier that's kept casual users away from Linux for decades, the fear of being stuck alone with a broken computer and no one to call. When that fear gets removed by a volunteer sitting next to you at a folding table in a community center, the technical barrier that remains is genuinely much smaller than people assume going in. The market share numbers, while still modest in absolute terms compared to Windows' continued dominance, tell a story of genuine acceleration rather than the usual flatline. Linux desktop adoption has traced for most of its history. Desktop Linux market share has been reported climbing to roughly 4.7% in 2026, the highest level it's ever reached. And while that might sound small next to Windows' overwhelming majority, the trajectory and the underlying reasons matter more than the raw percentage at this stage. This isn't a temporary curiosity spike driven by a viral video or a single news cycle. Vendor download data, government procurement decisions, grassroots support infrastructure, and a hard regulatory deadline are all reinforcing each other simultaneously, which is a very different shape of trend than past flickers of Linux desktop enthusiasm that faded once the initial novelty wore off. It's worth being appropriately skeptical of any single data point in isolation. A distribution's self-reported download numbers, for instance, are a meaningful signal of interest, but not direct proof that every download became a permanent, completed migration away from Windows. Plenty of people download a Linux ISO, try it on a spare USB drive, and end up going back to Windows after a week. But when that skepticism is weighed against a hard end-of-support deadline, a large incompatible hardware population, rising institutional adoption at national government scale, and dramatically improved day-one usability, all pointing the same direction at the same time, the combination reads as something more durable than past hype cycles. It's also worth being honest about who this migration is realistically for, and where the friction still genuinely exists, because overselling Linux as a frictionless replacement for everyone does the topic a disservice. Certain specialized Windows-only software, particular industry tools, some accounting or tax software, specific peripherals with no Linux driver support, and a handful of PC games with aggressive anti-cheat systems that don't play well with Linux's compatibility layers can still be genuine deal breakers for specific users with specific needs. Anyone deeply embedded in a Windows-only professional software ecosystem, or relying on hardware with no Linux driver path at all, isn't going to find this an easy or even sensible switch. And pretending otherwise sets people up for frustration rather than success. The honest pitch is more targeted than everyone should switch right now. S is squarely aimed at people running Windows 10 on hardware that can't take the free Windows 11 upgrade. People frustrated with Windows 11's direction who do most of their computing in a browser and a handful of mainstream applications. And organizations large enough that licensing costs and data control have become real strategic considerations rather than personal preferences. For that audience, and it's a much larger audience than it would have been even 5 years ago, the case for switching now is about as strong as it has ever been, for reasons that have nothing to do with Linux suddenly becoming perfect and everything to do with the practical dollars and cents deadline-driven reality Windows 10 users are actually facing this year. What makes this moment genuinely comparable to the scale of change around the original Windows 11 launch isn't the size of any single announcement. There's no equivalent press event, no Satya Nadella keynote moment people are pointing back to. It's the cumulative weight of several independent forces landing in the same narrow window, a hard support, cut off with a real expiration date attached, a massive population of otherwise functional hardware that got locked out of the official upgrade path, a wave of Windows 11 design and trust complaints that have been building for years, mature and genuinely easy-to-use Linux distributions ready to receive that traffic, organized volunteer support networks lowering the install day barrier to nearly zero, and now sovereign governments putting actual budget and political weight behind the same decision. Millions of individuals are making one laptop at a time. None of these forces alone would constitute the biggest migration since Windows 11. Together, happening at the same time, reinforcing each other in real time across individual households and national IT departments alike, they add up to something that genuinely earns that comparison. Not because Linux finally became the perfect operating system everyone always promised it would be, but because, for once, every reason for staying on Windows and every reason for trying something else are pointing the exact same direction for an enormous number of people at the exact same time. For anyone reading this and actually weighing whether to make the jump themselves, it helps to think through the decision in concrete stages rather than as one giant leap. On the first stage is simply figuring out whether your current machine is eligible for Windows 11 at all. Microsoft's PC Health Check tool will tell you in under a minute, checking your processor generation, TPM chip, and secure boot capability against the official requirements. If your machine passes, the calculus changes considerably, since you have a free, fully supported upgrade path sitting right there, and switching to Linux becomes more of a lifestyle choice than a forced necessity. If your machine fails that check, and a surprising number of perfectly capable computers do, that's the moment the rest of this conversation becomes relevant rather than theoretical. The second stage is testing the water without committing to anything permanent, and this is where Linux's live USB culture genuinely shines compared to how Windows handles trial installations. Nearly every mainstream distribution lets you create a bootable USB drive and run the entire operating system directly from it with zero changes made to your existing hard drive, just to see how your specific hardware behaves, whether your Wi-Fi card is recognized immediately, whether your laptop's trackpad gestures work the way you expect, whether your external monitor setup behaves correctly. This costs nothing but a spare USB drive in 20 minutes, and it's the single best way to de-risk the decision before touching anything permanent. Anyone seriously considering the switch should do this step before reading another comparison article, because no amount of secondhand description substitutes for seeing your own hardware behave in front of you. The third stage, for people who like what they see, is deciding how much of a clean break they want to make. Dual booting, keeping Windows installed alongside a new Linux installation, and choosing which one to boot into each time you turn the machine on, remains the most common on-ramp, letting people keep a safety net of their familiar environment while they get comfortable in the new one at their own pace. Plenty of long-term Linux users started exactly this way, booted into Windows less and less over a period of weeks or months, and eventually stopped bothering to maintain the Windows side at all once they realized they hadn't opened it in months. Others prefer to commit fully from day one, backing up their files to external storage or cloud services first, and then wiping the drive entirely for a fresh start. Neither approach is objectively correct. It depends on how much of a safety net a given person needs psychologically to feel comfortable making a change to a tool they rely on every day. It's also worth addressing the software question directly, because it's the part that causes the most anxiety for people on the fence. The good news is that the most common everyday applications people worry about losing access to almost always have a workable answer on Linux. Web browsers like Chrome and Firefox work identically. Office document editing is covered by LibreOffice for free, or by using Microsoft 365 directly through a browser, which sidesteps the compatibility question entirely since it's just running inside whatever browser you choose. Photo editing has GIMP as a free, capable alternative to Photoshop, even if the learning curve and feature parity aren't a perfect one-to-one match for professional photographers with established workflows. Video calling tools like Zoom, Teams, and Google Meet all run natively or through the browser without issue. Gaming has seen the most dramatic transformation of any category. Tools that let Windows games run on Linux have matured to the point where a large percentage of a typical Steam library now runs with little to no extra setup, something that was simply not true even 5 years ago. Though it remains an area where some research into your specific game library before switching is worth the time investment. There's a financial dimension worth spelling out in concrete terms too, since it's one of the clearest, least debatable arguments in the entire migration story. A household weighing whether to buy a new Windows 11 compatible e-computer is typically looking at several $100s at minimum for something reasonably capable, more for anything, resembling their current machine's performance level. Enrolling in extended security updates instead avoids that upfront cost, but trades it for a temporary patch with an expiration date already attached, after which the same decision has to be made all over again with even less goodwill toward Windows than before. Installing a Linux distribution on the exact same hardware that's already sitting on a desk costs nothing beyond the time it takes to do it, and extends that machine's useful life by years rather than months. For a family with multiple aging computers, a school district managing a computer lab, or a small business, running a fleet of point-of-sale terminals, that math compounds quickly into a genuinely significant number, and it's a number that gets easier to justify to a budget committee every year that Windows 11's hardware requirements remain unchanged. None of this guarantees Linux becomes the dominant desktop operating system the way some of the more breathless headlines this year have implied. Windows still runs the overwhelming majority of the world's PCs, and that isn't changing overnight regardless of how this particular moment plays out. But biggest migration since Windows 11 was never really a claim about market dominance in the first place. It's a claim about momentum, about a moment where the gravitational pull towards staying on Windows has weakened just enough, and the practical case for trying something else has strengthened just enough that millions of people who would never have considered it a few years ago are now doing exactly that. Not as an act of ideology, but as the obviously sensible answer to a very ordinary, very practical question. What do I do with the computer I already own, now that the company that built it has decided to stop helping me use it safely?